Should the day ever come when our ports and ships are targets for enemy sabotage, these men will be ready. Should the day ever come when the sea around us becomes a haven for enemy submarines, these men will be ready. Should the day ever come when this barren stretch of beach may become a point of entry for enemy agents, these men will be ready. Should the day ever come and mobilization be necessary, these men will be ready to answer the call of their country. So will 17,000 other officers, men and women of the United States Coast Guard Reserve. Lawyers and mechanics, shopkeepers and clerks, men and women who have what it takes, who at this very minute are drilling and training, preparing themselves to do their part. The roles and missions of the United States Coast Guard in peacetime are well known to most Americans. The heroism and work of the men of the Coast Guard is well documented in the news. Their influence is felt in all phases of American merchant shipping. They are known to all who cruise our waterways in pleasure boats. Since 1913, the long vigil of its men on international ice patrol has been applauded. Its polar icebreakers are familiar sights to the men of the Arctic and Antarctic outposts. Its record of finding the lost, of helping the injured, of saving those in peril at sea is unequaled. In peacetime, the Coast Guard must also maintain a state of military readiness. It must be ready to serve as an integral part of the Navy in wartime, or when so ordered by the President. To meet the greatly increased demands of wartime service, the regular peacetime force must draw on a cadre of trained personnel, now on inactive duty to bring it quickly to its fighting strength. The men and women of the Coast Guard Reserve are a well-trained, well-disciplined force in readiness. Ready, willing, and able to carry out their roles and missions should the day ever come and mobilization be necessary. Trained in many specialties to perform an even wider range of duties, the men of the Coast Guard Reserve can do almost anything under the sun. And they do, to be ready should the day ever come. At regular drills and classes held in training centers near their homes or places of business, reservists improve on their specialties. At this very minute, some of them are putting this training into practice on their 2 weeks annual active duty for training, either ashore or afloat. Under simulated conditions, they handle raging fires and train for every possible situation. This is the Port of New York. In a national emergency, upon full mobilization, this port and other major ports of the United States will be placed under full security. Men and officers of the Coast Guard Reserve port security units will be required to establish and maintain the safety and security of the vital port facilities in the continental United States, Hawaii, Alaska, as well as our territorial possessions. Reservists train now to board and examine vessels using our ports and harbors, and to seize and control enemy merchant shipping in our ports. They learn to regulate and control the movement and anchorage of ships in our territorial waters, and to control the movement of small craft on inland and coastal waters, and to conduct around-the-clock inner harbor patrols. Still others will regulate and supervise the storage and handling of explosives and other dangerous cargo in port areas. Even in peacetime, reservists can be found assisting in fighting waterfront fires in emergencies. Practical training that may prove invaluable should our ports come under enemy attack. In a national emergency, members of port security units will establish and enforce waterfront restricted areas. Port security officers will coordinate the efforts of federal, state, municipal, and private agencies dealing with port protection. For effective port security, trained reservists will be needed immediately upon mobilization, when harbors and ports are most vulnerable to sabotage. To be sure that they will be ready, port security units hold regular meetings and conduct exercises under actual conditions. Here, officers and men receive training in anti-sabotage techniques, counter-espionage operations, and chemical and radiological defense procedures. With classroom mock-ups like this, the various ways of handling dangerous cargo are studied. Theory is put into practice on the reserve training ship Courier, as reservists learn to actually run winches and other cargo handling gear. During exercises and their annual active duty training, they observe the real thing firsthand. Reservists also learn to control the movement of great numbers of people in and out of busy waterfronts. To round out their training and to ensure the safety of our ports, should the day ever come. In time of war, the regular Coast Guard must also be expanded rapidly to carry out its additional missions afloat. Although Coast Guard cutters operate with less than 2/3 of their wartime complement at present, they ably carry out their peacetime roles and missions. Search and rescue in all kinds of weather, on the high seas and waters adjacent to the United States and its territories. Meteorological and oceanographic research as man accelerates exploration of the inner space. The maintenance and operation of navigational aids in domestic and territorial waters and along our shorelines. They open ice-locked rivers, harbors, and the Great Lakes for commercial shipping. Should the day ever come, and Coast Guard vessels require wartime complements, the additional personnel will be drawn from reserve vessel augmentation units all over the country. These units will provide the trained officers and men to bring the peacetime ships, over 250 of them, to their full wartime strength. They will serve aboard every type of vessel that flies the Coast Guard ensign, from 30 and 40-foot utility boats for inner harbor patrols and surveillance, 82 and 95-foot patrol boats for harbor entrance patrols and coastal search and rescue, trim 210-foot cutters for coastal convoy escort and anti-submarine patrols, and sleek 378-foot high-endurance cutters for ocean station patrols, search and rescue, transoceanic convoy escort, and anti-submarine warfare duties. Large numbers of trained specialists will be needed immediately after mobilization to man the vessels, operate the complex equipment on board, and to maintain and make repairs to keep the vessels operating at peak efficiency. Officers will be needed to guide and direct these operations. The reserve vessel augmentation units will supply these officers and men. These units will also be called on, come M-Day, to activate ships presently in the mothball fleet. Vessels in this group range from 200 to 400 feet in length and are primarily combatant types. Members of the vessel augmentation units will make up the majority of their activation crews. And will be responsible for restoring the decommissioned vessels to operating condition for wartime service. Many of the skills needed to activate a ship in the reserve fleet require extensive training. Reservists must study and learn these skills. Electronics, operation and repair. Communications. Navigation, and countless others at weekly meetings and on training cruises, to be ready should the day ever come. Aviation also plays an important role in Coast Guard operations, peacetime or wartime. Rescue and surveillance operations that were once restricted to coastal waters and the cruising speed of ships have been greatly expanded by Coast Guard planes. Amphibious aircraft capable of flying hundreds of miles offshore, landing and picking up survivors. Huge long-range patrol planes that can search thousands of square miles of ocean in a single day. Helicopters, the flying lifeboats, with their ability to hover and take off and land vertically, can make rescues in areas inaccessible to conventional aircraft and surface craft. To belong to the Reserve Aviation Flying Program, air crewmen must be ex-servicemen with aviation ratings, and former armed forces pilots must be designated as Coast Guard aviators. They train with Naval Reserve aviation squadrons 1 weekend a month and on annual active duty for training. Developing the skills which will be needed in wartime to keep Coast Guard planes in the air. These men will augment operational Coast Guard aviation units to fly the major aviation missions of the service: search and rescue, surveillance of coastal areas, and emergency support and logistics for isolated shore units and vessels at sea. In addition to the Reserve Aviation Flying Program, officers and men are trained at aviation support units, where they learn repair and maintenance of aircraft, weather observations, emergency procedures, air traffic control, and the administrative functions necessary to keep an air station running smoothly. On the ground or in the air, aviation units of the Coast Guard Reserve will be ready, should the day ever come. Believing that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, the Coast Guard enforces all federal laws relating to safety of vessels of the American Merchant Marine. The Coast Guard becomes closely associated with nearly every phase of life of an American ship. From the first blueprint, to be sure that safety is designed and built in, by periodic inspection of equipment and personnel, through its lifetime of operation, to its final trip to the scrapyard. Upon mobilization, present Merchant Marine safety commitments will be greatly expanded. Not only will more shipping in and out of United States ports come under closer scrutiny, but Merchant Marine safety functions will also be expanded overseas. Should the day ever come, reservists training in Merchant Marine safety units will be called to active duty as needed to investigate marine disasters and to inspect ships under construction for the wartime fleet. Many more will be needed to test and approve materials and equipment to be used in them. As more and more vessels are placed in service, even more reservists will be needed to inspect and certify them. Still others will be needed to enforce load line requirements. Reservists will also be assigned to license and certificate merchant crewmen, supervise their signing on, discharge, and paying off, and look out for their welfare while aboard ship. Additional reserve Merchant Marine safety personnel will be needed to screen and process applicants for identification cards and other seamen's documents to help ensure the safety of our ports and ships as thousands of seamen move in and out of vital waterfront areas. Reserve Merchant Marine safety personnel will be ready, should the day ever come. Thousands of other reservists will be called to assist with increased operations in other mission areas of the service, to help operate, maintain, and service more than 40,000 aids to navigation, lighthouses, markers, and buoys. Upon mobilization, additional officers and men from reserve units will be deployed to augment existing forces at isolated coastal shore stations. and LORAN stations at home and overseas. Some will stand long night vigils overlooking lonely beaches. Others will work in communication or rescue coordination centers, planning and directing efforts to rescue aircraft or vessels in distress at sea. Or in the Amber Center with its electronic brain that keeps track of thousands of merchant ships at sea to be called on for rescue of other vessels if needed. Because the roles and missions of the Coast Guard Reserve in wartime are so many and so varied, every man must be a specialist, not in one job, but many. To develop these skills and increase their professional knowledge, many reservists are assigned to 2-week courses of specialized training at a reserve training center each year, in addition to their regular weekly or weekend training periods. While some develop mind and body ashore, others cruise aboard trim Coast Guard cutters at sea for their 2 weeks annual training duty, or receive 2 weeks instruction and experience in major port area operations. Summer training always proves interesting, whether they've had the roll of a deck beneath their feet, a new world around them to explore, strange lands to visit, or a mock nuclear, biological, or chemical attack as a major training exercise. During training and travel, reservists gain experience and knowledge that will serve them well, both in service and civilian life. They learn to do a job and do it well, and the value of teamwork, of pulling together to get the job done. Some reservists have already learned this as ex-Navy, Army, Marine Corps, Air Force, or Coast Guard regulars. Many others with no experience volunteer while still in school, signing up for one of the several reserve programs offered by the Coast Guard. Initial active duty training varies from several months to 2 years for these reservists without prior military service, depending on which program they've signed up for. Officers may join the Coast Guard Reserve after fulfilling their active duty obligation. Some are former Coast Guard Academy or Officer Candidate School graduates. Others receive their commission through direct commissioning programs while on inactive duty. Aviators in the Coast Guard Reserve are former Armed Forces commissioned pilots. Women are also active in the Coast Guard Reserve in administrative functions. Known as spars, they attend regular drills and are offered active duty training annually to develop and maintain the skills needed during wartime. It has been said that sooner or later, every generation inherits the responsibility of running the nation and keeping it strong. The men and women of the Coast Guard Reserve have willingly accepted their responsibility. These men and women will be ready should the day ever come.